Thank you for joining us today for part 3 of our Global Perspective series on information in the digital age. I'm Cortney Hurlock, Director of Global Ties San Francisco, a division of the World Trade Center, Northern California. I want to give a shout out to my colleagues, Alana Crandall and Kim Todd, for doing a fantastic job on parts 1 and 2 of this series, and for their collaboration with me on part 3. Through our work on private and government programs like the U.S. Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, we aim to grow global fluency and mutual understanding authentically through person-to-person diplomatic exchange and professional engagement. As a World Trade Center, we work to promote an economically vibrant Northern California and help companies develop their international business by making trade easier through education, resources, and tools. For part 3 of our series, we will be exploring cybersecurity and disinformation campaigns. Who are they targeting? Why are they so successful? And what can be done about them? I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome our 4 accomplished speakers and subject matter experts joining us today to share their insight and to answer our questions. Danielle Deibler is CEO and co-founder of MarvelousAI, a natural language processing and analytics platform company focused on narrative discovery and tracking around elections, policy, and social issues. Danielle has 25 years in internet security, software development, and machine learning and AI. Dr. Kevin Limonier is an associate professor in geography and Slavic studies at the French Institute of Geopolitics, University of Paris 8. He's vice director of Geode, a research center dedicated to the geopolitics of the datasphere. He is head of the Observatory of the Russian-speaking Cyberspace, a research unit dedicated to the post-Soviet segment of the digital space as a new geopolitical and technical object of studies. He gives lectures in several universities such as Saint-Cyr-Couët-Guidon, French Military Academy, and has been a lecturer of geopolitics at the Russian State University for Humanities for several years. His work focuses on the history and geography of the Russian cyberspace and on the development of new methods of data collection and data visualization for mapping digital exchanges, borders, and conflicts in Eurasia. He is also a specialist of innovation policies in USSR and contemporary Russia. And Dr. Limonier is one of our International Visitor Leadership Program alumni, and he visited San Francisco in May 2019 as part of a cybersecurity program for France. Nick Monaco is the director of the Digital Intelligence Lab, a research lab that focuses on disinformation at the Institute for the Future, a think tank in Palo Alto, California. Nick is an expert in social media bots and Chinese disinformation. His latest work, Detecting Digital Fingerprints, Tracing Chinese Disinformation in Taiwan, documents disinformation campaigns about COVID-19 and Taiwan's recent presidential election. And it was just released yesterday. And I think he's going to share the link for us in the chat. Vera Zakem is Senior Technology and Policy Advisor with the Institute for Security Technology, a new institute in the Bay Area that bridges technology and national security policy making communities to outpace emerging security threats. Vera has been a leader in countering malign influence campaigns and disinformation space throughout her career. She has led initiatives and partnered with U.S. policymakers to address disinformation campaigns, most notably from Russia, with particular attention to coming up with whole-of-society practical solutions to the challenge. She has also been part of the tech community, having led research and strategy at Twitter to inform the health of the public conversation. I'd like to start off by asking Danielle, what is important to distinguish between a cyber attack and disinformation campaigns?
I'll take myself off of mute because that probably helps. So I think the biggest thing is making a distinction between a cyber attack is typically a kind of an offensive attack or action taken by a threat actor, and it really targets your computer information systems, your infrastructure, your personal computer device, and it's trying to usually steal, maybe alter or destroy data, or keep a data system or infrastructure from being able to respond. So it's about taking you offline or stealing your information. And those things tend to have particular motivations behind them. They tend to have a monetary motivation of some type or a disruption, right? Causing some kind of a disruption in service for people. I think that the difference when you're talking about a kind of a misinformation or disinformation campaign is it's really an information influence operation. You're trying to change opinions or hearts and minds, right, for lack of a better word. It could have a monetary component, and there is some overlap between the two, especially when you get into things like social engineering attacks that manifest in terms of something like a phishing or a spear phishing campaign. So an email that you get that wants to collect your credentials and use them for some nefarious means, or maybe just use them to change your mind about something. Those types of attacks tend to have a lot of overlap. And there also tends to be some overlap between the ways that you might detect different types of campaigns that are out there. So you may look at when a domain was registered or who the people are that own a particular domain if you're trying to understand whether it's an influence operation or they're just trying to distribute some kind of malware to you. So there's definitely overlap in detection and tracking, but where you start to come a little bit apart is in legal ramifications. So the ability for you to prosecute essentially fake information, usually it's a civil tort versus a criminal act, whereas cyber attacks can usually be criminally prosecuted in most countries. And then the other place is actually in detecting them and tracking them down. Typically with an information influence campaign, you need really a multidisciplinary team that understands the on the ground and the motivation, whereas you probably are pretty good with like computer scientists and accountants, right, on the cybersecurity side. So, and that's pretty much about it. There's probably a lot more, but I don't want to take all the time.
Great. Thank you so much for giving us that context. Okay, now I'd like to ask the rest of the panel to share some notable examples with us of targeted disinformation campaigns from around the world. We can get started with Nick, please.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here today. As Cortney mentioned in the intro, I'm excited about the timing of this seminar. We just released a report on Taiwan and particularly on Chinese disinformation yesterday at Institute for the Future. And I dropped the link in the chat. I'll drop it again, but basically it's just iftf.org/disinfo in Taiwan if you want to read it. But one of the things we explore in that report that really is one of the most kind of malicious campaigns I've seen in 5 years of looking at disinformation was a COVID-19 or coronavirus disinformation campaign that came from China and targeted Taiwan. And basically the goal of that campaign was to, it happened after a recent presidential election in Taiwan. So it was about early 2020 in February and March when this was going on. And it's persisted since then as well. But the goal of this campaign was to sort of sow fear about the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, kind of the ruling left-wing party in Taiwan, and basically say, look, the DPP is in power. They're not reporting all the cases of what's going on. It's a little bit graphic. They're burying bodies in construction sites and mass secret graves. And there are all kinds of kind of graphic photos that were spread on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube to allege these things. But basically these were out of context photos from the 2006 Indonesia earthquake and stuff like that, other natural disasters. What was interesting about this campaign was, of course, it's about health, but it's quite political as well. We see that there is sort of an intersection between manipulating a health crisis with disinformation for political gain, which again was to undermine the ruling government in Taiwan and undermine faith in the response of the government in Taiwan. What's striking about this is that Taiwan actually has arguably the strongest democratic response to the virus to date. Fewer than, I think, 1,000 cases. I need to check the latest numbers, but a shockingly small amount of cases for a country of 24 million people in its proximity to China. And again, just the kind of the perfect storm of combining health and political disinformation into one was really a powerful combination that I think a lot of researchers have been seeing all around the world, not just in Taiwan right now. So that's kind of My most recent example, I think one of the most interesting examples of targeted disinformation campaigns with a very malicious intent, and that is, we go into more detail in the report if you want to read about it.
Thank you for having me today. I appreciate the invitation. As a specialist, as you said, of Russia, of course, I'm very interested in what we call the Russian disinformation and manipulation campaigns. And regarding the areas I'm interested in, that is to say, the French-speaking areas, West Africa, France, of course, West Africa, Canada. One major example we can have today is how disinformation is developing today in Western Africa. And it is a very interesting pattern because you have a kind of mechanism of devolution of manipulation, as I could say, to local actors. That is to say that the pattern is quite different from what we saw in the US, for example, in 2016, or even in France in 2017. Here, what we are facing now in Africa, and it's very important if you see it from Paris, because as you know, the French government has boots on the ground in the Sahara fighting Islamist groups, and we know that there are some kind of manipulation, or I could say some influence campaign targeting especially France in the area, using some old, I would say, anti-French thoughts that you might find in several countries such as Mali or Côte d'Ivoire or Central African Republic. We know that especially in Central African Republic, the issue is quite big because some Russian businessmen took some very important position there many months ago right now, and that these initiatives of offering to some African governments some military security aids is going with some advices about information, influence, digital influence, etc., etc. So here the border between digital influence and information manipulation is quite thin and quite difficult to grasp. But what we can see is a group of websites using not only fake news, not only totally fake news, but oriented news in order to fulfill some geopolitical goals that are not only the geopolitical goals of Russia or China in Africa, but also the geopolitical goals of local actors who are using the narratives produced by Moscow or Beijing in order to fulfill their own political agenda. And this is a very, very important and very interesting pattern, because it is a pattern that we might encounter in Europe or in Northern America in the years to come, because it is quite a kind of a new business model of information influence after the first phase we saw between 2016 and now.
Actually, most of my career has really focused on understanding both Russian disinformation and malign influence in various parts of the world, but most notably in Europe and the former Soviet Union, before I started also looking at this issue more globally, as well as in the United States. Well, look, you know, in the US, you know, we started really looking at this, researchers and policymakers and leaders and technology leaders started looking at this issue since 2016, when been very, very well documented that Russia played a role in interfering in the US election. But, you know, Russia has been doing this for a very long time. And I'm not just talking about sort of, you know, historical Cold War active measures. I think, you know, what we are looking at as sort of the modern day disinformation and influence campaigns, you can kind of go back to even 2008, where Russia was involved during the Russia-Georgia war and was using actually both information warfare as well as cyber campaigns. And, you know, so since then, I mean, and to Kevin's point, Kevin talked about Africa, I mean, look, Russia uses a number of toolkits, if you will. So one is very much to discredit sort of allied Western institutions, depending on what part of the world you're looking at. But it is also, as we've seen in the United States, but we've also seen this globally in different parts of the world, it is to reduce that social cohesion. And certainly, you know, when I look at my time having really doing this work, very much actually on the ground in various parts of the former Soviet Union, from, you know, Baltics to Balkans and, you know, Western Europe. I mean, this is what it is. And I will say, you know, we talk about, you know, I will say we talk about disinformation, like it's just is the thing, you know, manipulating online, obviously on social media. But I want to point to a couple of very, very important things. Disinformation does not just happen on social media, full stop. If you're looking at social media, that's just not, it's part of the problem and a solution. The second is it happens on mainstream media because there's very lack of free independent journalism. You have journalists and you have everyday populations who are not really trained how to think critically. And there's so many of these kind of weaknesses in the society to make that happen. And then another point that I will say is it also happens offline as well. Part of the reason why disinformation is so dangerous, and we have seen this case with Russia, is that it's this ability to proliferate from the online environments to offline to potentially cause harm. And the last point I'll make, and this has literally certainly been sort of Russia's MO, if you will. Certainly, again, I've seen this in the former Soviet Union space and broadly in Europe. You know, it's that disinformation is only one small part of a broader malign influence campaign. We cannot discredit, and Nick talked about this, you know, in his part. He's talking about China and Taiwan, that, you know, there's politics involved, there's economics involved, there's other aspects, right? So disinformation, again, one piece of a broader pie here.
Thank you so much for giving us those examples from around the world. And I would love to now talk a little bit about how is it happening? You know, how are AI, social media bots, and other digital tools being used to spread this disinformation, and why are they so pervasive? You know, why can't we get rid of them? So I'm going to have Nick and Danielle answer this question, and go in whichever order you'd like.
Sure, I can kick us off quick if that's okay. I mean, it's a complex question. I think a lot of what gets talked about in terms of AI and disinformation is bots, and there's a lot to say about bots. I've done a lot of research on bots for the past few years, but it really is just part of the larger theme, and I'm sure Danielle will have more to add there. But bots, essentially, which I'm sure you've all heard about by now, are computer programs that control social media profiles online. And basically, you can automate conversation with other humans. You can also automate messaging or retweeting of content that is advantageous to whatever message you want to spread. So back in especially the early 2010s, like 2010 through 2012, 2013, it really was about this simple, like people would program simple computer programs to make a certain hashtag trend on Twitter, especially in places like Mexico or Ecuador or Turkey. And we'd see that people in power were using Twitter bots to kind of drown out protest messagings, to kind of interrupt democratic protesters' organization and information sharing efforts. But things have gotten a little more complex since then. Especially since the social media companies like Twitter and Facebook have started to pay more attention to automation of profiles on their services. So out of necessity, and this is something you see a lot in the cybersecurity world, again, as I'm sure Danielle can attest to, basically these malicious actors, people who are building bots, get caught building simple bots, so they have to evolve. They have to start making something that's going to pass above the threshold of what Facebook or Twitter is looking for. So over time, like today, what I'm starting to see a lot more is cyborgs, basically accounts that are controlled by humans some of the time and controlled by a computer part of the time. Now this can be happening, could be a human controls it during the day and a computer controls it at night, but it can also happen simultaneously. And we did a blog post about this on the Democratic debates like way back about a year ago in September. of 2019, where we actually saw there were cyborgs that were retweeting the hashtag Yang Gang, promoting the presidential candidate Andrew Yang back then. So basically, I go into detail in the blog post. You can check it out at medium.com/digintel. But basically in the tweets, when you download the information, you can see where a person tweets from. And so there would be these tweets that were pretty human looking and they just come from a web browser. Then there would be tweets that were invariably retweets that had the hashtag Yang Gang that would come from something called Yang Gang Retweet Bot. So you could see very clearly in the data that this was a cyborg. So that's just a small, simple example, but basically the takeaway there is that bots are evolving, they're getting more sophisticated, and they're harder to detect because of this, and in part because what has become defined as a bot is evolving, right? Sometimes it's a human, sometimes it's a computer program. So it's quite difficult to detect, and it's a moving target. So I'll pass the baton to Danielle, who I'm sure has a lot to say about this.
So I think that building on kind of what you've talked about in terms of bots, one of the hardest things is actually that there's so much marketing automation out there that is typically for legitimate purposes, right? You're trying to market your brand, or you're trying to get the message out there for a new campaign that you're running. And so these cyber actors that are running influence operations or threat actors that are out there that are kind of engaging in typical cyber warfare, they're using those same tools that your business uses to promote a blog post, right? Or to promote a news story and get people to come to your site or download a coupon. So all of those same facilities are available to them. And then you have kind of the other side of it, which is a little bit more AI powered. The bot side is really just, I think a lot of it is the evolving cyborg bots that are out there now, where you have people who are using them legitimately and people who are using them illegitimately, and it's really hard to figure out which one is which. But you also have computational linguistics, which is powering the ability for us to create news stories that might be fake, might not be fake, might be gibberish, but populating sites that are out there that are either masquerading as local news sites or masquerading as a right-wing or a left-wing site. So you have a lot of technology right now that is available for legitimate purposes that's being repurposed by people who want to spread disinformation campaigns. And just like you take an ad out, right, on Facebook or Twitter or a website to pull people into content, these people really think in very much the same ways. How do they persuade you to click on this ad? And then how do they use MailChimp and, like legitimate, Google Analytics to track your behavior and all of those kind of things. All of those tools that you have available to you to market your legitimate site or your legitimate business, they're all available to these same threat actors. And they know how to utilize them. And they've become very sophisticated as a byproduct of that. So, I guess I don't want to really say like AI and machine learning have powered the ability of these campaigns, but they have to some degree, right? The more marketing automation we create, the more ability that these actors have to utilize those same tools, but utilize them in a way that spreads disinformation. And that's only aided by things like what Vera was talking about, where you have state-sponsored actors like Russia who are very sophisticated in influence operations, and they start to utilize these things. And then other groups that are more domestic pick them up and amplify them as well, because it legitimizes their operation to be supported by one of these state actors. And then I'll hand it back to Cortney.
Great, thank you. So we've already kind of touched on this topic a little bit, but I wanted to see if we could provide a couple, we'll have Vera actually talk a little bit about election interference and the work that you've done around that. And then if Danielle could give a quick follow-up of another example as well, and that would be wonderful. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to election interference, again, it's now been part of multiple actors' toolkit and playbook. Again, I'll go in for prosperity historical reference, go back to Russia here. Again, not even touching on the US, but also touching on because obviously this is a well-known case that we're paying attention to right now, but also touching on different parts of the world as well. Because again, when you think about election interference and foreign interference, it's really fundamentally is about when you have a polarized society, and when you have this kind of polarized environment, and really going for who is likely going to be the candidate that that hopefully will win, that you want to support, who will help you achieve, from the adversary's perspective, the desired objectives here. So, I mean, to me, that's kind of what it's about, and what kind of, if you will, internal societal cleavages and partisanship, one can exploit to make that happen. So again, when you have those cleavages, when you have the polarization, when you have sort of instability, societal instability, it's much easier, I think, to do, foreign interference. Again, with Russia, in terms of example, I'm thinking this certainly has been the case in many parts in the Soviet Union, for sure. We can also talk about, for example, Germany over the years as well. But again, I think we can probably, not just talking about Russia, we can kind of see that happening, and by other actors, other threat actors in other parts of the world. The one other thing that I would say is what we're now seeing, at least in the U.S. context, and I think we're also seeing this in other parts of the world. It's, we so much, again, with Russia, it's like so much focus on Russia. Okay, great, that's the one actor, but there's, again, other state actors, and there's also non-state actors as well, who may align or may not align, but they're there. So I think what I'm thinking about, what I'm really concerned about when we're talking about election interference, whether the actors have a very direct stated objective or not, is this congruence of actors that they can potentially maybe either formally or very much informally be working together.
We did two projects. So one is very recent. I work with the League of Women Voters in San Francisco, and I'm on their board. So we had a problem where a lot of our members were coming to us and telling us that they had heard that they had to affix postage to their ballots when they returned it, their vote by mail ballot when they returned it, and that they had to figure out, how many postage stamps to get on it. It came in a variety of different mechanisms, primarily through Facebook, and then got amplified on Twitter. And so it started to manifest in people sending us email asking us, do I need to affix postage stamps to my vote by mail ballot to return it, and have it be legitimately returned to my election office? And actually, that was completely fake information. There was no validity in it. Every California vote by mail ballot will come with a postage paid envelope that you return the ballot in, but it had been pervasive enough that it reached our member base, and a member base of a pretty savvy audience as well. But they began to get really concerned about that, and luckily what we had happen was they came to us and asked about it. And then the other example I'll give is we did a project with a group called Rebuilding Algeria in 2018 that was triggered by a 5th presidential term for their incumbent president. And we monitored Twitter traffic and some other social media as well, and found that there were a lot of rumors that were being perpetuated by UAE and Saudi-based accounts that were suggesting that the protesters, it wasn't a legitimate democratic protest, they were terrorists, and they were kind of crossing the line. There was a lot of violence. So that was kind of the pervasive narrative from the Algeria side of things. And I'll hand that back.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, this next question is for Dr. Limonier. In our discussion last week, you mentioned that there have been some cases where attempted election interference failed, and that it isn't all doom and gloom. So can you share some examples with us and talk about long-term investment in the problem?
Yes, a little bit of optimism, because indeed, election interference might fail. When we talked last week, I was thinking about Madagascar, where an attempt of election manipulation took place in November, December 2018, that completely failed, actually, because a Russian non-state actor tried to improve the scores of some candidates, but totally failed. But this is not, according to me, the most relevant example. I was thinking about it this weekend, and in fact, the most relevant example I have in mind is France in 2017, during our last presidential election. Here in Paris, everybody was afraid of a kind of DNC-like scenario. That is to say, a huge leak like you had in the United States with the Democratic National Committee, having an influence on the vote, etc., etc. And indeed, a leak did happen. But the way it happened, we think that it was a failure because, of course, the French staff of Emmanuel Macron was aware of the danger. If it happened to the Americans a year before, it could obviously happen to us a year after. So they were awaiting something. And when this something happened, they had a plan. At Macron's electoral staff, because the attackers tried to enter into the servers of the campaign, exactly as they did during the American presidential campaign. They tried to enter into the servers by some kind of phishing attempt. That is to say, trying to penetrate into the server and extract the data. They knew that this kind of attacks was impossible to stop. So they decided to flood the attackers with false data, false passwords, fake information, etc., etc. So to give more time to the campaign. And what happened is that the attackers managed to extract the documents, but only 24 or 48 hours before the second round of our election. So basically, the attackers did not have the time to sort the huge amount of data they extracted. And we do believe that it was a failure because obviously it did not have any impact on the campaign. The data still exists, but the time was not, they did not have the time to use it against Macron. So here is a kind of failure, I could say, allowing us to think that there are some kind of counter strategies you can implement. Finland is a very good example of how you can make some long-term investment in terms of fighting disinformation and in terms of developing a kind of digital hygiene among the population, because I do believe that short-term solutions for fighting disinformation are practically useless. I mean, you can debunk things, you can do whatever you want to say it's fake, etc., or it's manipulation, but as we say, promises only bind those who believe in them. So people who tend to believe some kind of narratives produced by the Russians or other actors, you cannot counter it with short-term strategies. So Finland has a kind of culture of strategical resilience because obviously they live just aside of Russia and they share a very tumultuous history with their neighbors, and many times this country has been shown as an example of how you can educate a part of your population in order to sensibilize the public, the general public, about these kind of issues.
Great, thank you. Okay, so for our next question, a lot of people think that since big tech and social media companies created the platforms and then the social networks that are used to disseminate disinformation, that they should be responsible for fixing the issue and for getting serious about punishing violators. I wanted to go to Vera on this one since you have worked for one of those notable big tech firms, and I want to know what your response to this is.
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer this question. Look, without question. I think tech companies and social media platforms in general have both provide challenges, but they also have a responsibility, right? To make sure they're transparent, to enforce, create policies that are meaningful in addressing disinformation, promote the health of the public conversation, and enforce it accordingly. I think also, and I think you see this not just at Twitter, you definitely see this at Facebook and some of the other platforms. There's this positive, I don't want to use the cliche of tech for good, but there is this positive element of platforms, and that is to actually get the information out there for the users and for the consumers, for example, for COVID, for COVID. Facebook, I'm thinking of, has a COVID information center. So but here's the thing, and this is actually something Kevin was talking about Finland. I was like jumping up here because it's kind of correlated to this. I'll tell you why. Technology and tech companies are only one small part of the pie in addressing disinformation, both dealing directly at the very tactical level with takedowns or enforcements and setting policy. And then also, just overall addressing. You cannot do this alone because you have to be working with this in partnership with governments, and I think there's a lot of wonderful cooperation right now, I would say, between government and tech. But also, you can't do this without civil society. The civil society is doing so much to address this, because fundamentally disinformation is a people problem. If you cannot address the issues that are affecting the people and the root causes, if the environment is weak and the vulnerabilities are there, I don't care how much tech, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whoever else takes down, or amazing technology that's developed. Yes, all good, and it's part of both, again, challenge and the solution, but it's only one part of it. So if we're really going to be serious about addressing disinformation and broad influence campaigns in that construct, it has to be this whole of society approach, and I cannot understate that enough, how important that is.
Great. And is there anyone else that would like to jump in on this question as well before we move on to the next one? I just want to open it up to you.
I mean, I feel like I could talk for 20 minutes on this question for sure. I'll try to do less than that, but just a couple quick points. I think Finland's a great example. I'm glad that Vera and Kevin both brought it up. And I think that honestly, Taiwan's in a similar situation. I would argue that Ukraine, to an extent, Vera's obviously our panelist expert on Ukraine, but this, in the sense that these places are contiguous to big disinformation powers, so I'll use that term, and I've been thinking about this for decades. We're thinking about this before online disinformation became a household term. And so I think that's part of what lends to the perspective of how do we combat this long term? Where do we put funds to think about this as a long-term problem and not just something that is a trend on TikTok that'll be gone tomorrow, or whatever it may be. And I'd just like to echo Vera's point about civil society as well. Taiwan is probably the most lively civic tech sector on earth. There's a GovZero, which is kind of a hacktivist and civic tech community that meets regularly to build things like Kofax, a fact-checking bot on an encrypted chat application, or build tools that help people know where masks are available during the COVID campaign, so there aren't runs on masks or panic about that kind of thing. And all of these are, initiatives that are citizen-led, but that do influence the government and do influence even big tech and how they think about these problems, and have a demonstrable effect on, countering disinformation and false information, and really making things safer and easier to giving tech and government some space to think about these problems, with a little more patience and with the long term in mind. So those are the quick points I'd like to add.
Great. So I was actually going to ask another question here, but I feel like this would be a good place for this other question, which is, so how do we educate people? If it's a people problem that we're having, and this, information, we don't know what to read, or what's right, what's fake news. How do we educate people to be better consumers and to also protect themselves to make sure they're not passing on information that's, incorrect. And anyone can answer this one.
I think I'll jump in for like a minute on this, but I'm going to echo what like 3 other people have said at this point, which is it is actually about educating your population. Media literacy is not the only thing that you can teach, but I do really feel like in this case, Finland is a great example where they're teaching media literacy, how to look at a Twitter profile and understand where things come from, how to understand social media profiles in their adult education centers and in their like primary and secondary schools. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be embracing across the world, across the globe. Like the type of literacy that we need to be teaching people isn't necessarily what proper grammar is, right? Or, how to look at a card catalog. And I'm showing my age a little bit there. But it's literacy for the type of media that's going to be pervasive for you. And right now that is online media. And I'm not saying that's the silver bullet. The types of things that Nick was talking about, like the GovZero stuff, people writing tools, you need all of that civic activism, and you need people to be engaged and pushing the government to put the right types of policies in place that make it harder for these types of campaigns to be successful without necessarily squelching free speech. But if your populace isn't educated, it really is very, very hard to fight somebody's desire to agree with something that they want to agree with, right? So, and that's why a lot of these campaigns are so successful. So if you want them to fight that, you need to educate, and it needs to be from every level. When a child is on social media, they need to understand what they're looking at, and adults that are newer to it, they need to know what they're looking at. So my 78-year-old aunt needs education just as much as my 4-year-old cousin who's on their iPad. And I'll hand it off to another panelist.
Yeah, let me touch on that. I 100%, 1,000% agree with Danielle here. It comes back to, education is the capital E, probably most important, more important than fact checking, more important than anything else, right? And here's a great example. So I'm going to give you 2 things. On the education piece, one piece. We're now living in COVID. We're living in a global pandemic where everyone is online. Imagine both the disinformation and the cybersecurity threats affecting our children from elementary school or from grade school to college. And are our children educated enough where they can discern what's fake, what's true, and everything in between, and actually see the difference? I'm not so sanguine that's the case. So we need to start there, right? And then it kind of goes up. The other thing is like we need to be educated on how we actually talk about this thing, because how I mentioned earlier, disinformation in these influence campaigns are also spread offline as well and from people to people. You see something online, you see something on Twitter, even you learn how to use Twitter, or you learn how to use effectively Facebook if you're a journalist, but then you go talk to your aunt, to your friend, to other members of the family. And that you're able to kind of educate it that way, because so much of this travels to friends and family. So I think this is important. But again, 100%, it's not just the traditional, let's just train more journalists. 100%, that's correct. But journalists are one of the segments of the population that this affects. It really, that's what, when I talk about the whole society approach, that's what I mean.
All right, awesome. Thank you both. Okay, so I'm going to insert a question from the audience. And this is from Steve. It seems to me that big tech could use AI to track where articles enter their system and provide a chain of attribution on a post. If you could see origin Twitter bot from China on a social media post, that would lessen its impact. Is that possible? Is that the smart, right thing to do? What do you think? Anyone can jump in here.
I'm happy to comment a little bit on the possibility, right?
Okay.
So just like it's hard for any of us, right, on this call to understand what the original attribution of a post is. It's probably, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it is also difficult, frankly, for the social media network. So if, I'm not going to use Twitter or Facebook. I'm actually going to use Instagram as an example. Instagram is a very closed and like insulated network. So it's really actually hard to understand where something came from other than it came from Instagram, right? Like the picture got posted, it got sent out. It might get picked up on other networks, but it can be difficult for you to understand where a particular thing came from. Now, there are mechanisms out there like reverse image searches on Google and Yandex and Bing to try to figure out where the origin of an image was, for instance. And those social media networks, they could attribute that information to that particular post, but I think it's hard to get to, this came from a Chinese bot, right? Like getting to something that specific, that other than saying, hey, here are other sites this was posted on, without them making an assumption that that account that it came from is a Chinese bot. So now you're assuming that they're doing all of the legwork for every post that comes in. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it isn't as simple as it sounds, I guess, right? It isn't. I think they could be doing a better job. I will say that, right, on the tech company side. But I think it's not the simplest problem in the entire world.
I think that when you have a set of domains you're investigating or a URL that you like kind of down the line, you know, okay, this is spreading a certain kind of disinformation and maybe it's coming from a state actor. I think this is a step you follow kind of like later down in the process. I think technically it would be feasible, but depending on like what the scale of the operation is. If it's spread a lot, I think that makes it more complicated. And if it is something that, you know, was posted for the first time in 2014 and you're investigating this in 2020, then maybe you don't have that data stored anymore. And some of this comes down to the question of like, what data do you store, how much do you store, and how long do you store it for? So those are all questions to keep in mind here. And it's also interesting to know that like even presuming a system did this perfectly, this just kind of shifts, kind of like the whack-a-mole game I was talking about before between hackers and cybersecurity professionals. This will kind of shift the focus for bad actors to add an extra step or a step somewhere else, right? To like seed an article with someone so that they'll put it on Facebook, which is not that difficult of a problem. So I think it is helpful and I think it's technically feasible, but ultimately may not have a huge impact. And also to determine whether or not an account is a Chinese bot, so to speak, is sometimes not a trivial problem. I mean, that's an understatement. It is a tough problem, even when you have the access of someone on the platforms. But you're absolutely right that AI is a necessary way to, a necessary tool to use to crack down on disinformation, because there simply aren't enough humans to do content moderation at the platforms, and there can't be. And I'm happy to elaborate on that later if need be.
All right, thank you. I'd like to now ask all of you, and you don't all have to respond, but also Dr. Limonier has already touched on this a bit with sharing some optimism that we might have for the future. But I'd like to know where the rest of you might see some hope for the future in addressing disinformation campaigns.
I mean, I'll start then. I think for me, where I see hope, I feel like, first of all, we've come so much further or so far in really understanding what are disinformation campaigns and broader influence campaigns now than, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, I remember when I started doing work in this area before 16, there were very few people who were actually looking at this holistically, both on civil society, on obviously government, but also on the tech side. Obviously 2016 election, not just for the US, but also what that meant for the world, that this could happen anywhere else in the world, really brought light to that. So I think as a first point, there's just more attention to the issue now. There's a lot of diverse voices and perspectives from technology and technologists. I mean, Danielle's company is a wonderful example, to the platforms, to governments, and to civil society and academics that work in this issue. So that's really, really great. And then and as part of that, the second point is, I just see now so much more information sharing, open source research, on this stuff that really, having worked this issue for a while now, I've just not seen this in a way than, say, again, like even 5 years ago. So I think I see hope in the sense that now, that because of this information sharing, because of this now this collaboration that I really see across multiple partners, there's hope on that. And the very last thing I'll say, yes, adversaries are always adapting, right? They're not going to use what the techniques and the tools that they're using now, in 4 or 5 or 2 years from now. But you know what? On our side, on this whole society business, we're also learning and adapting.
Two things that I think are really just good steps in the right direction are the fact that this is a problem that's being, spoken to and listened to, and being a lot of people are paying attention now, including, big social media companies, governments, and everyone. You need to pay attention to solve it in a bigger way. Back in 2015, when I started this kind of work, and subsequently in 2016 with the US presidential election, we were sounding the alarm back then, and a lot of scholars were sounding the alarm before I was, and no one was paying attention and no one cared, least of all the social media companies. But that has very much changed. They're investing in the problem and attacking the problem, which is huge. So that gives me some optimism. The other thing is Twitter, credit where credit is due, is proactively releasing data sets of disinformation campaigns on their platform, which is a huge boon to researchers to figure out, like, what does this stuff actually look like, and keep learning about the problem on an ongoing basis. So Twitter's released more data, I think, than certainly has been used by researchers to inform how we understand the problem. So yeah, that's a huge step that I think really was something we advocated for in the past that I never thought would happen, and that all of a sudden it happened. So those are two things that are good for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I would say that in the future, what we should do is, okay, now we have indeed a civil society with a lot of savoir-faire in order to investigate, etc., etc. I also do remember when I worked on these issues and nobody cared. But now there is another issue that is coming in front of us, I think, and that's something we realized here with the Yellow Vest movement we had 1 or 2 years ago. We need to stop criminalize, I would say, the consumers of fake informations. I will explain why. Because the people who are consuming this information, at least here on this side of the Atlantic, I'm not talking about the United States, where the problem is maybe a little bit different, but here in Europe, we need to stop criminalize these people, because if these people are consuming fake news, junk news, etc., that's not because they are bad actors or whatever, but that's because most of the time it's simply people who want to know how the world works and who want to go closer to the politics. And the problem we had with the Yellow Vest movement in France is very symptomatic of a part of the society representing itself as living outside of the core of the society. And for them, consuming some kinds of these junk news is a kind of reflex in order to exist and to try to understand the world, and to understand how the world works, etc., etc., etc. And so today, I would say that we need to go deeper into our comprehension of how these consumers of fake news do actually consume it. Because in this time of COVID-19, etc., we see it on both sides of the Atlantic. There are people who don't want to wear masks or whatever. Why don't they want to wear masks? Because they don't trust the authority. And why don't they trust the authority? Because there is an education problem, because there has been a lot of political problems. So we have, I think, to address the political, education, a psychological side of this issue, because I'm quite confident in the fact that a lot of these people, if you explain well the issues, you can convince them that they are actually consuming part of junk news, and that some actors like the Russians or whatever are of course doing a business of it. So I think that's a forefront issue, according to me.
I just want to comment on that really quickly. I'll be really fast, I promise. So I think that Kevin brought up a really great point that is actually maybe even echoed in the United States, which is when you have policies that can be exploited by foreign actors, and parts of your population that can be exploited, things like the Yellow Vest movement, things like income inequality, things like people feeling their personal freedoms are being taken away from them. You as a government, this is where policy really does come in and your politicians come in. That's the part where you have to understand, how did somebody get into that person's head and make them show up for that in-person event? And those are the types of policies and the types of political kind of, meanderings that we need to get rid of from a government perspective, just because they leave you less open to exploitation by your own domestic actors and state actors as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of that and all of your input and these wonderful examples. And I want to, I already integrated one question from the audience. I do have one more that I wanted to squeeze in, and this one's for Nick. Nick, you mentioned a disinformation campaign that occurred after the Taiwanese election in an effort to undermine faith in the Taiwanese leadership. Is it common for disinformation campaigns to occur after and not before an election?
Yes, would be the quickest answer. I'll be brief, but yeah, great question for sure. But yeah, this is an ongoing issue. In cybersecurity, there's kind of, you track APT actors, advanced persistent threats, the persistent being, this is something that's going all the time and you have to look for it all the time. And I think in the last few years, disinformation researchers have really come to adopt parts of that model because this is a persistent threat that goes on all the time. But yeah, there was disinformation before, during, and after this Taiwanese election, which is, again, is common in elections around the world. If you want to sow disinformation about the result of the election, or contest the results or cast doubt on them, then after the election is a great time to do that. But it is common, and it's something we see in more elections than we don't, I would say. Good question.
Great. Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank everybody for joining us from the audience, and of course, our wonderful speakers for their time and valuable contribution to this discussion about disinformation campaigns. I definitely feel more informed. And again, thank you so much, and can't wait to work with you guys in the future.